Now very pleased to introduce Floyd Miller, who is the librarian of the Northern Indiana Amish Library. It's located a little east of here on West 100 South. This is a research library and an archive dedicated to Amish history. It was established in 2008 and is owned and supported by the Amish communities of Northern Indiana. It contains over 600 genealogy books, plus Amish directories, cemetery records, plat books, local and Anabaptist histories, as well as some family Bibles and early printing of prayer, songs, and devotional books. And it's got some artifacts as well. If you'd like to arrange a visit, the phone number is in your booklet to do so. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Floyd Miller.
Good afternoon. Earlier today, rather this morning, I said good morning to a group of people that I do that regularly to. They are, on the average, they're probably about 50 years younger than our audience today. I'm teaching school. I stayed there until we dismissed for lunch, and then I quickly went home and got ready to come out here. So I had my mind on them, and probably 10 or 15 minutes ago, they started for home, and their day was over, and the second part of my day is starting. I was asked to talk about the first Amish coming to this area, and this is one of the interesting topics for me. I'm interested in history, and some people think if we're interested in history, we're interested in all history. But there are so many different parts of history that most of us probably have some favorites here and there. And my favorite, I like genealogy, but as far as going way back across the ocean, I don't spend as much time there. One of the reasons I have to rely on the research of others, and they don't always agree, and I'm not going to argue with it. But I like to concentrate on the ancestors that were here in America, in Pennsylvania, coming to Ohio, and especially the ones that came to Northern Indiana. I think some people have been wondering why they chose a Miller to talk at a Yoder reunion. And I wondered about that myself when they asked me to do this, and I think it was at least 2 years ago. And as time went on, I realized there's more Yoder in me than I really recognized for the most part. A lot of different lines of Millers and Bontraggers and so on, but there's also Yoders, but it's in the great grandmother area where and there's I think there's only one of the Yoder ancestors that actually, of the men that moved to Northern Indiana. But in a lot of ways I trace back to that. Now if I can do this properly here, we'll try to move on with why they came here. And that takes us back to a question. I'm sure the people that talk with the tourists that come to Shipshewana, Indiana, receive a lot of questions to answer. And one of them that has come to my attention in the last few years is the question, who was here first anyway, the Indians or the Amish? I think that's one of the questions that we do have the answer to. There may be some others that we don't. but that is one we do have the answers to. That the Indians were, for the most part, were removed from this area just a few years before the first Amish came to this area. And why did they choose this area? How did they decide to come to Northern Indiana? They we heard about life in Europe for the Amish and the Mennonites, the Anabaptists as a whole. And I think it's really thought-provoking that the Lord saved this continent for like a second chance for the people, for His people to move to, and to have provided it for this length of time. People were looking for a country, a place to go where they could farm in peace and live according to their convictions. They came across the ocean, which was a trial in itself, I'm sure. Went across the mountains. Jacob Hosteiler massacre happened the way it did in Pennsylvania. They moved to Somerset County. And in the 1830s, I think it was in 1837, there was a ministers' meeting held in Somerset County, Pennsylvania, or that area. I think there was like 3 different congregations. They were actually not touching each other, I don't think. They were like separate communities that got together. There were 13 ministers there. There was like 12 main issues that they discussed. Things that they were issues, things that they didn't approve of, that they saw that they need to work on, and so on. And these issues were about dress and conduct, some of them. So that may have played a part in why some people decided to move to the West. But I think the spirit that led our forefathers to cross the ocean and then to come across the mountains to western Pennsylvania probably was very much alive. This go west young man, people going further west, it was getting crowded. I don't know what they would say about Shipshewana today, but if they thought Somerset County was getting crowded, I think they would probably be ready to move on west now, which I don't. I grew up here several miles out of town, but I've seen a lot of changes growing in Shipshewana and so on. So my perception is that it was probably the go west young man to go for new country, cut out their own farms out of the woods, and where land was not as expensive. But I feel the same spirit that had brought them that far was stirring, and maybe with some of these issues that they were facing, they were more inclined to think about moving west. One of these ministers, a young minister by the name of Joseph Miller, was 28 years old, approximately 28 years old at the time of that meeting. And I've noticed that within the next 5 years, quite a few of the ministers that attended that meeting, the older ministers passed on and the younger ministers moved out. Joseph Miller, along with a few others, he seems to have been the leading figure during the migration and the organization of the Amish Church in Indiana. Joseph, which was ML 279 in the Gingrich Kreider book, and his older brother Daniel S. Miller, Joseph Spiker, and Nathan Smiley set out to search out the land. And it seems like they had a destination in mind, which was Iowa. And that was probably from word of mouth that settlers or explorers or people that had traveled to the west brought back. So they started down the they went to Pittsburgh, from Johnstown to Pittsburgh, and went down the Ohio River. By the way, this map here, or the part of the story, is based on a little booklet that was written by one of the original settlers, and later a larger booklet was printed with more information in it. 2 years ago, or maybe just a few years before that, the Indiana history book that we have been using for years was out of print, and the publishing company that was printing that decided that they were not going to reprint it. My cousin that sells school books and used to be a school teacher decided to make a new history book, and they got the permission from the Hayes Publishing Company to use any information they wanted to out of that book, and came up with Indiana History 2015. They used quite a bit of the same information. They asked for help around the community, people that were willing to help, and this was one of the chapters that I tried to help with. I supplied this map for them and so on. So I, in turn, copied it out of the book. So they went down the Ohio River, and the original account is very brief. It would be great if they would have kept a detailed journal. I'm sure it would be very, very interesting. They went down the Ohio River, which would have been probably the easiest part of their trip, and then to the Mississippi, which would have been at Cairo, Illinois. Went up the Mississippi River to Burlington, Iowa. They went on foot across Iowa to where the present counties of Johnson and it names a few more. Walked across that area, and they liked the area well, they said, but because of there was a lot of flooding, and there's a lot of sickness there, so they decided to go across Indiana to check that out too. So you can see the different symbols we used here. So they went across Illinois to the little town of Chicago. And across from there they could go with boat across the southern tip of Lake Michigan and to the mouth of the St. Joe. I didn't realize this is going to be in front of me a little bit. It's I should have put more things on the map, but the water from this area, from northern Indiana here, from the very north part, flows into the St. Joe River, which goes up into Michigan and goes into Lake Michigan. So if they came across the southern tip of Lake Michigan to the mouth of the St. Joe, they could go by boat and then upstream on the St. Joe River. The record says as far as they could. I wish they would have said to Elkhart or to Goshen or how far, but it says as far as they could. But we know it was passable, navigatable past South Bend, so evidently they didn't have to go too far. They came to Goshen. They went to the south edge of Goshen where the Elkhart Prairie is, and I'm sure it looked like a lot of work with all the huge trees that are described in some places to cut down all these trees to start their farming. So the Elkhart Prairie probably looked kind of appealing to them. And they decided that not only, it doesn't say that, they decided here's where they are going to come to make a lot of money. And this is where they're planning to bring their families and have their church. So that was one of their concerns, maybe more than see if they can make a lot of money here. Okay, in this group, I should have mentioned a little bit further, was this Joseph Miller and his brother Daniel, and Joseph Spiker and Nathan Smiley. I think he was, forget now, was it Irish? Irish and raised Amish, or at least he was Amish by that time. And I put this, I think he has a unique tombstone. That is in the Elkhart Prairie Cemetery, the south edge of Goshen. And he was one of the scouts. Going back to our original picture here, they after they had decided that the Elkhart Prairie is where they were going to bring their families, they went home. We have another record in the 1882 history of LaGrange County that they stopped at Amos Davis's place. Amos Davis lived close to the Forks, and actually the first Pashawn, which was later Pashan post office, was in his home. He had a mill there along the river, and they had stopped at his place. They went, then it says they went home. And in the 1882 history book, it gives the length of time they were gone. They were gone 2 months from home. And I'm pretty sure they got into places where they had very poor or no cell phone reception too, to make contact with their families at home. They may have been able to send a letter when they crossed the Mississippi River again. I don't know. Or at least maybe when they came to the Mississippi, they may have been able to send a letter back home. I don't know if anything like that happened, but they did go back home, and they must have been enthused and talked to their friends and neighbors and about moving to Indiana. The next year, Joseph Miller and Daniel Miller, the two brothers that had been on this trip, along with their cousins, began their move to Indiana. Joseph Spiker moved. I'm not sure which one, but I think I know which one. Moved to Maryland about that time. I don't know. We can use our imagination. Maybe his wife wasn't, after these 2 months, his wife wasn't impressed with traveling out that distance. And Nathan Smiley was not with this group either, but they had a child born about the time the rest were moving to Indiana, and by the next year they were in Indiana too. So it was probably the pregnancy that kept him from traveling with the rest of them. So in 1841, on June the 3rd, and according to my calculations with what I could find, that seems to have been on a Thursday. I kind of expected to find it on a Monday morning, but according to that, it seems like it would have been on a Thursday. Joseph Miller, with his wife, Elizabeth Yoder, and Daniel S. Miller, whose wife was Barbara Holstadler, but her mother had been a Yoder. So here we had Yoder blood in the very first group coming to Indiana. These two brothers, plus their cousins who were brothers, Joseph Bontrager and his wife, which was Elizabeth Yoder, and Christian Bontrager, the younger brother, was about 25 years old. His wife was Elizabeth Baumgardner, whose mother was a Yoder. So here in the first four families, the two Bontrager brothers and the two Miller brothers were cousins. The Miller brothers' mother was a Bontrager. So if I've done this presentation a number of times, and usually I concentrate more on the Bontragers because, and if there's any name that should have been tagged to this community, any last name, I feel it should have been Bontragers, because the first four families were either Bontragers, our mothers have been Bontragers, and practically all the Bontragers from the east came to northern Indiana, not just a few out of a family like in some of the other families. So they started their journey, the four couples, total of 16 children, left Somerset County, Pennsylvania on June the 3rd. They drove through Holmes County, Ohio, where they rested for about a week. And we don't have that information, but I would think that definitely they would have stopped to visit their grandfather, John Bontrager I, who was living in east of Farmerstown, Pennsylvania at that time. And this photo is taken from the corner of his farm where there's a cemetery. The highway crosses down through the valley from one corner to the other of his farm. So I would assume they would have definitely stopped at their grandfather's farm on their way to Indiana. They rested and visited there for a week. Then they continued with their journey. And these symbols show how there was the Black Swamp close to Archibald, Ohio, which was Fulton County and Williams County were the last two counties settled in Indiana because of the swamp. So they had to go north into Michigan, and I assume followed like US 12 area or Fawn River Road. It went west to White Pigeon and then south. And the last day that they were on the road, they camped at the state line north of Middlebury. Then the next morning, on June the 29th, which was again on a Tuesday, according to the way I calculated it, they drove on through Middlebury and out to Goshen, which there was, at that time, there was two angling roads or trails going in that general direction. And they arrived on June the 29th at the Elkhart Prairie, where they lived in huts a few months. But this is where they had been planning to buy land. But by this time, the land was already too expensive for them. So they moved, they went a little bit further east into the hills, into the woods to buy land. And Joseph Miller, his first farm, he bought that on July the 9th of 1841. He bought 280 acres for 2,626 acres. So, seemingly said the land was too expensive for them on the Elkhart Prairie, but they must have had a decent amount of money with them to buy that many acres. And Joseph Bontrager, Joseph Miller was a minister already in Pennsylvania, and Joseph Bontrager was a deacon. He was also known as Sepp in German. Joseph Miller lived on County Road 38. His land came out to County Road 38 and 35, and Joseph Bontrager's land was behind that on County Road 36. And both of these have plaques on stones out by the road, although the one for Joseph Miller, I think it's in front of the wrong set of buildings. There's two sets of buildings, old buildings on that homestead, but according to the way he then sold his land later, I feel his main homestead was along County Road 38. But in 1991, I think it was, when they commemorated the 150th year that the first Amish came here, a committee was formed, and they put these plaques on these stones to mark these the four places where the first Amish had lived. The one, Miller and Bontrager, farms were back to back in Clinton Township, Elkhart County, and the other two, Daniel S. Miller and Christian Bontrager, settled in LaGrange County in the Forks area, and their land was also close together. Daniel S. Miller bought 160 acres for $825. That was close to where the Forks Mennonite Church was. And Christian was where the place we know as the Staley Farm. but the original buildings were 1/4 mile further north, and that was probably not the best land, or maybe nothing cleared or no buildings, because he got those 80 acres for $375. And most of these were bought in July of the first year that they were out here. In that fall, several more families came from Ohio. Emmanuel Miller, preacher Isaac Smooker, Jacob Kaufman's, Jonas Hostadler's, and Israel Miller's came from Ohio and settled in the area. Emmanuel Miller's were in LaGrange County, and Israel Miller's were also, to start with, Israel Miller's were in Elkhart County. Jonas Hostadler's were on the farm where the Miller Cemetery in Elkhart County is now located. And Isaac Smooker lived along County Road 34, actually in two different places there. And that October, a daughter, Esther, was born to Christian Bontraggers, being the first Amish child born in the community. That fall, the first worship service, sometime in that fall, we don't have a date for it, was held at the Daniel Miller home in the Forks area. In February of that year, Eli Bontrager was born, the first Amish child born in Indiana that survived. He was a son of Joseph Bontrager. On March, Daniel J. Hostadler was born to Jonas Hostadler's, and that was one of my ancestors. Was also the ancestor of Eldon Hostadler, who collected the Hudson cars over here. Maybe you took a look at those, and there's more of his descendants here today. On Easter Sunday in 1842, the second worship service was held at Joseph Miller's home. We have this record from Isaac Smooker's son. Isaac Smooker had the opening that day, Joseph Miller the main sermon, and I assume Joseph Bontrager read the scripture, being the deacon here. A few weeks later, or 2 weeks later, this firstborn child here passed away, the first recorded death in the community. That spring, some more families came, John S. Miller's and Joseph Hirschberger's, whose wife was a sister to John, their mother, Philip Wyrick's. All these were connected with Joseph and Daniel Miller. And then the Abraham Hirschbergers, their son John, Christian Hostadler's, Henry Miller's. Here the Joseph Hirschbergers didn't have to go through something that most of them did if they moved west. They brought with them, or traveled with, all their, on both sides, both sets, parents that were her mother, her father wasn't living, and his parents, and all their surviving siblings that hadn't already moved to Indiana traveled together, except for two half-brothers for the Millers. There was also Henry Miller was in that group, and a few years ago at an auction I bought the Bible that he brought with them, and in that Bible they wrote in the day that they came, and also some family history and so on. That is kept at our Northern Indiana Amish Library. And they moved to the farm where Indiana Wood is now, and that is, some of that land has been in the family, stayed in the family ever since. The David Lamans, the Christian Miller family, there's also, I'm sure they had exciting times, interesting things happened, but there's also much sorrow in this pioneering life. The Christian Millers, whose wife was a sister to the Bontraggers, they moved here in 1842, and later that same year he passed away. They had 3 little daughters, and she remarried in the next 2 years or so, and some of those descendants are still around here, but her brother was the Gardine. They didn't sell the farm for 10 years, I think. That fall, some more came, John Miller's, Joseph Miller's, and Jonas F. Miller's, Eli Chupp's, David H. Miller, and a Valentine Yoder, who was married to a daughter of the David Schrock. And this was the David Schrock see, SKB 7, I think is his number. They lived around the area where what we call the Butcher House corner, County Road 35 and State Road 4. Later, this Valentine Yoder's brothers and sisters then moved to the Napanee area, which we'll get to later, and talk a little bit more about him. Here we have the plaque on the Joseph Bontrager, what used to be the Joseph Bontrager Farm, which is across from the Clinton Union Cemetery, which is just a little bit south and west of the Clinton Frame Mennonite Church. And here's the tombstone then for Joseph Bontrager. Now going to the 1864 map, it shows where some of the, I don't know if you can read that or not. I didn't know how big that is going to be, and it didn't come out too plain. We'll move on here. In 1843, they ordained a bishop. They had two ministers here, Joseph Miller and Isaac Smoker, and Isaac Smoker was ordained. The next spring, Jonas Hostadler was ordained the minister, the first minister to be ordained here, the first Amish minister. 1844, John Bontrager, who was a minister, moved in, and by the way, his wife was a Yoder. About this time, the sons of Dick Grishtel Yoder, the YR2344 line started moving in. There was Joseph, who was the ancestor of Rachel Kreider, which was probably one of the things that instigated her research in the Yoders. Then there was Tobias C., John C., and Valentine C., who lived close together, their farms touching each other. And because of that, they were kind of in the side of the community. Because of that, that area has been known as the Yoder Corner. And some people have asked, well, which corner is actually the Yoder Corner? And it's not like a certain crossroads that it's referring to. It's referring to like the corner of the community or the area in the community where these Yoders had moved to. That is common known knowledge that these three lived there together. But there was also three more, and actually Joseph was here before the others, and he lived across the road from the Town Line Conservative Mennonite Church to start with, and then he moved just a little bit to the northeast of there. Jacob also owned land close to his brothers, but his wife, who was also a Yoder, and her family lived south of Goshen, close to the Elkhart Prairie. And Jacobs lived in the area across the street from the Goshen College along 8th Street in that area. And there was a sixth one who first moved to Elkhart County, Harmon C. Yoder, and then in 1854 he moved to Elkhart County, a little bit further north than the rest of them. And I noticed, and that farm has been in the family ever since. At one place it went from the owner to a grandson, but it is in the family since. And I noticed Daniel Miller, the owner of that today, is here with us. Another group of Yoders, not a different group, but a different family, the Reuben Yoder family. Reuben Yoder was married to Harriet Reel. In the 1882 history book, it gives their biography, how they got married, and very soon after that, they went on their honeymoon, I guess, and traveled to, loaded their belongings on a wagon and moved to Indiana, and bought land a little bit south of Shipshewana, and lived on that. I think that was in 1851. They bought that land, and I think it was about 1908 when they sold that farm, and he moved to his son Moses' place, and he bought that 160 acres there for $560. And his brother Christian had first settled in Elkhart County. Then he moved to a farm next to Reuben's the following year after Reuben got here, and he bought 160 acres for $480. In 1845, some differences arose here. Some of these people moved in from Pennsylvania and some from Ohio. Some had more progressive views, and others wanted to be more conservative, I guess. And so they, because of that, at a time there, they started holding separate church services, with Bishop Smoker being the only minister in the one group, where he immediately ordained a minister and a deacon, which this Valentine Yoder we were talking about was then ordained a deacon. A few years of that, they didn't feel good about that. They got help in from another area, from Ohio, and were again united, where they could fellowship with each other. But by that time, there was so many of them here that it was time to divide geographically, forming the Clinton Church and the Clinton District and the Forks District. But with that, they were fellowshipping with each other, but that created some moving. Some people moved from the Forks Church to the Clinton area, and some from the Clinton area to the Forks Church, seemingly where they were a little bit more comfortable. And from that day, since then, there have been some differences, but for the most part, the main group has been able to fellowship with each other. There's been times when some of them, other groups formed, but either they moved out or eventually were not horse and buggy Amish. And along with this moving, this Joseph Miller from Elkhart County moved to the Forks Church, where he was ordained a bishop 2 years later. At that time, they had only two ministers in the Forks Church, one being John Bontrager III, and the other one being Joseph Miller. Coincidentally, were both my ancestors. And Joseph Miller was ordained the bishop. 1846, David Schrock left Somerset County, Pennsylvania, rode his horse out to see this land here, left his horse as down payment, and walked and got other rides on the way home. Went back to Pennsylvania to get his wife. His wife was a sister to the Bontragers that had come. The following year, his wife, along with the Joseph Ashe family, which were Joseph Ashe's wife was a sister to David, moved to the Forks area. And in the Ashe family record book, we have a good detailed article on what they found here. It gives a good description of the land, the large trees and so on, which is interesting. It says they could see cattle and deer wandering about in the woods 40 and 50 rods away, and there was very little underbrush and huge trees. That reminds me of my great-grandfather's diary in 1887. He wrote down that on that day they cut down a tree. It was a walnut tree, and it was 5 1/2 feet in diameter. I wish he would have mentioned if he chopped it down or if he cut it with a saw. It was probably at that time with a cross-cut saw. Just what would a good tree like that be worth today? A cleared walnut tree like that. But they used a lot of those for sheeting boards for up in buildings because they had plenty of it. In 1849, a Christian Hostetler, he was a brother to one of the first settlers' wives, Daniel Miller. He and a friend rode their horses to Indiana to see this land. Before they weren't going to just take the word of people of everything that's coming back from the west. They wanted to see it for themselves. So these two guys rode their horses to Indiana to take a look at the land, and Christian became sick. He stayed at his sister's place and died there, and was buried on their farm, and that is close to the Forks area, where the what we call the Miller-Glick cemetery, and today it is known as the Miller Glick Stutzman Cemetery because the Stutzman family close there has started to use that cemetery again. The tombstone reads that he died on November the 31st in 1849, which is, if he tried to live on a day like that, is maybe no wonder that he passed away, because there's nothing like November 31st. But that was just an error. That reminds me of a neighbor, an older neighbor that I knew real well, shared with me one day. He said they found a journal of something where accounts were written in where people passed away and with the cause of death. And for this one, it was jotted in, the cause of death was nothing serious. Poor excuse. But I think what it was probably old age, and maybe he didn't have a heart attack, maybe he didn't have a stroke, anything like that. But it was nothing that they could put a name to it. Like my brother related in a meeting we had this spring, that he asked our grandmother, who got to be 98 years old, by the way, what her little brothers and sisters died from. She said, well, I guess just what children died from in those days, you know. If the children died, they knew they died, but a lot of times they didn't know from what, you know. One of her brothers, they had taken along to church one morning, not realizing that he is sick. And that day he took sick, and they did not take him home that evening. They took care of him at the place where church service were held, and he died that night. It was so sudden. And, well, they knew he had died, but they didn't have the means of figuring out why on everything. So this Christian host idol that died there stayed at his sister's place and died and was buried on that farm. The family was in a home in Pennsylvania and did not know anything about this until the friend came home leading the horse. We can only try to imagine the family counting the days that Dad has been gone, maybe expecting him back any day. Maybe if he lingered a little bit, maybe it took some extra time, and then finally they see the horse coming back. It's one of the things the pioneers met with. Now, moving on to 1864, a Jonathan J. Yoder, which was the YR 25122, whose second wife was Catherine, the YR 26124, was the only, that I'm aware of right now, the only one of my ancestors, Yoder ancestors, where the male ancestor actually came to Indiana. And he settled here just south of town, and they stayed here. They're buried out by the Yoder Cemetery and so on. And this line was more from the Worcester, Ohio area than from the Somerset, Pennsylvania area. By 1867, Henry C. Yoder, which was a brother to this Jonathan's second wife, came to Elkhart County, and maybe we'll get to that family later once we get to some stories. I want to give an overall view of the settlers coming, and then maybe go on with some stories. So soon after, within the first year that the Amish were in this area, they were holding regular church service. I guess I failed to mention, on Easter Sunday in 1842, they had church services, and from that point they started holding church services regularly. While about in this same time, a different group of people from Wayne County, Ohio mainly, moved to the Napanee area. Maybe before, can you read these? Can you see these names here? No? Okay. Those maps are available that from 1864. We obtained one of the very few 1864 maps still intact here, and it was probably not unwrapped for years and years. It was bought by somebody and placed in our library, and I have it on a table underneath glass. So, and it's very interesting to see how the roads went. But this does list where these three Yoders, main thing I had this up here for was the three Yoders that lived close together. And here's a plat of the 1874 Newberry Township in LaGrange County, Indiana, which you might be able to read a little bit, or we can, if you're really interested, you can look at the maps in the book. And this shows where, and we also have this in our Indiana history book, the circle part there roughly shows what the area where what we call the LaGrange Elkhart County, or it includes Noble County now, community has grown to, and the Napanee area happens to be in 4 different counties. Yes, I think they're all, and part of it is in the same county, also in Elkhart County, as the western part of this community, and they actually established a church line here, and there's neighbors from our community with the Napanee area that live close together. And for now, I'm not sure, with horse and buggy, if you'd start in southern Michigan, go across here and across the Napanee area, there's quite a distance that you could drive with horse and buggy and stay at Amish homes like every night. And about the same time that the Amish were moving into our area, some others were moving into the Napanee area, but there were no ministers involved in the start. So they did not have an organized church there, but periodically drove with wagons or rode horses over to the Clinton area to attend church services. Young folks rode their horses over here to take instruction and become members of the Amish church there. Until first there was like Christian Staley, Moses Hausauer, John Ringenberg, John Emmert, and Cyrus Berlincourt, who was from Switzerland. These were people that were more recently from Europe than what the ones that came to our area. But also coming from the Berks and Somerset County, with Berks and Somerset, Pennsylvania roots, was the Daniel Yoder family, the YR 1, 2, 5, 3 families. There was Israel Yoder. Valentine had first lived in close to Goshen, and just east of Goshen, and was ordained deacon. When Isaac Smucker ordained a deacon, he ordained Valentine. Then when they merged again, eventually, in a few more years, there was another division, which was then permanent. And then, but the 2 ministers that were ordained by Isaac Smucker then stayed with the old order. Valentine's father-in-law and all his wife's brothers and sisters that were living in the area east of Goshen went with the Amish Mennonite movement or German Baptist, and his brothers were Amish, and brothers and sisters were Amish in the Napanee area, which I assume is probably why he moved to the Napanee area. And if you're familiar with the book, The Lord is My Shepherd, that starts out with this family, Valentine's daughters, one married to Simon Kemp and the other one to August Wicke, where the 2 mothers passed away, and that line, which my wife descends from that line. So she is from this Valentine. There's Susanna, was married to a David Hostadler. Veronica married to his brother, Manasseh Hostadler. Magdalena married to Jacob Smucker. Simon Yoder, and then there's Jonas, and Elias was, I think he was the oldest of the family, but came later in life. This church was then organized in 1853 by bishops Levi Miller from Holmes County, Ohio, and Joseph Miller from the LaGrange, Indiana area. So today, that started out, and I don't think that first group, or in the first years that they came to try to see how big an Amish community they could start, they were just trying to find a place to take their families, and I don't know what their vision was. Did they think that maybe someday there'll be like 3 church districts there, like in what they left in Somerset, Pennsylvania, or what they expected. But today, this area here, we have Amish directories that are made about every 5 years, and the most recent one is due to come out in the next month or so. And I contacted them to get more current information. In that directory, there are 5,200 households listed in 180 church districts, all connected here. That is just to this line here. And of those 5,200 households, there are the household heads. There's 632 Yoders with household heads. So out of the 5,200, 632 are Yoders. I think it's the third most popular name, most common name here. And this community is the 3rd largest Amish community. While the Napanee area, which had a slower start and a little bit later, they also grew a lot. They now have 44 districts with a total of, this was the 2015 directory, 1,235 households, with 84 of those with Yoder household heads. So we have a lot of households here where the last name is Yoder, but I'm not sure about the Napanee area. But in our area here, I think there's very few children born today, Amish children born today, that do not have a Yoder background. If they do, they were probably from parents that have more recently moved here, because we have a lot of Yoder background, particularly with the intermarriage. Just like the Bontraggers, I've gone to schools, talked to them about Joseph Johns and our Bontragger line and so on. And the one place I went to, I could connect every single child back to Joseph Johns and the Bontraggers, including their teachers. So that I think that'll conclude the first part of it here. Okay, if you're ready, we'll try to move on with the second course, or maybe the dessert, if you will. If you're a Yoder, some of you have been able to find your family names here. I put this together, and it's not. It doesn't include the complete families. It's more just the ones of the family that came to Indiana in the early days. Starting at the top, there is the Christian D. Hostatler, who died, who came to scout the land and died in Indiana. Barbara was married to Daniel S. Miller. They were the first settlers. David, who had lived in LaGrange County first, and then in Elkhart County, and joined the Dunkard Church. And Emmanuel, the Hostatler book, I didn't write the number down here, but you can look that up. And there's married to Fanny Stutzman. Says he married in 1847, I think it is, in his cabin in the woods in Indiana by China Smith. I assume that was probably a justice of peace, or maybe a minister, I don't know. And he lived on a farm on the LaGrange Elkhart County line. If you come out of Goshen on State Road 4 and continue to the county line, and then turn to the left, it's the first farm. Actually, the farm comes down to the corner. That's where, somewhere on that farm in the woods, this Emmanuel was married in his own cabin. And the next family here, son of Joseph Yoder, the children of Joseph Yoder. Elizabeth was the wife of Joseph J. Miller, the first group to come. Mary was married to Daniel Johns, who came a few years later. They had three daughters. Two of them that got married. One was to Joseph Miller, and the other one to John Staley. And we'll get back to that, to the Staleys, with a story later on, if I don't poke around too much with other things here. And there's the two brothers, Christian J. Yoder and Joseph J. Yoder. Both moved to the Forks area, and they were married to sisters who were Aishes. They both came in 1852. The Christian J. Yoder farm is still in the same family today. The Joseph Yoder farm was where the original Town Line Conservative Mennonite Church stood. They bought an acre from him, and that farm was in the family until approximately 1990, I think it was, when that was sold out of the family. Next, we come to the YR 2337, the Christian C. Yoder. He was married twice. His first daughter from the first wife was Barbara, married to the Joseph Bontrager. Again, the first settlers coming here. The next one was the daughter married to Daniel C. Nisley, and he lived in the Yoder Corner area next to her cousins, where the Yoder Cemetery is today, for a number of years. Then he moved to 1000, which would be to the west and north a little bit, and eventually moved to Kansas. David C. Yoder came with his daughter to close to Middlebury, where they were looking for land. He came here and bought land and went back to get his family, his wife, and his children. And by this time, he had his second wife. She refused to come with him, and he had bought land out here. According to their family history, he came to move to Middlebury on his farm and send her money for the rest of his life. She living in Pennsylvania, he living out here. And there's Christian. He first lived in Elkhart County, and then moved to just south of Shipshewana, that I spoke about a little bit ago. And Magdalena, who married to the Joseph C. Yoder, one of the Yoder Corner brothers. So here we have a connection between the 2337 family and the 2344 family. And Catherine was married to John Johns, which were the ancestors of Lauren Johns, our genealogist here. And Reuben, who married the Harriet Reel and moved to south of Shipshewana very soon after their wedding. And if I'm not mistaken, Chris Yoder descends from Reuben. And that farm is like 3 miles from my house. And Rebecca was married to Samuel J. Schrock, and they moved to between Shipshewana and Middlebury. I think it was in 1866 or 7, somewhere in that area. And when they were moving with the train had a wreck, and his team of horses were killed, and the railroad company paid him $700 for his team of horses. Moving on to the next family here is the John Bontrager III, one of the first ministers in the LaGrange County area, whose wife was a Yoder, Christian, and Joseph was then, when the Forks Amish Mennonite Church started, he was the first minister to be ordained there, his father being an old order Amish minister, and he was ordained in the Forks Amish Mennonite Church, where he served for some years, and then he and some others started the Town Line Church, where after his first wife passed away, he married and he was like 52 years old, he married his 18-year-old hired girl. And with that, there were some rumblings going on, and so he decided it maybe be better if he moved somewhere else, which he did. And eventually, in one of the places he lived, there was no Amish Mennonite church, so he affiliated with the Old Order Church again. He moved out to Glendive, Montana, and some of his descendants were in that area, or maybe they're still there, or just a few years ago. So the rest of the family here, John J. Bontrager IV was lame John. Barbara married Daniel J. Miller. During the break here, somebody came to me and mentioned that he wondered where Barbara is buried. Her husband, Daniel J. Miller, was the son of Joseph Miller. And we know where she was buried. I descend from that one, and then also from the Manassas J. Bontrager. The Daniel J. Bontrager just before that used to live where Yoder Popcorn is, and then the family, most of his children moved to Kansas, and they eventually moved to Kansas. Today, a lot of the Amish that spell their name Borntrager, B-O-R-N, and then maybe a T-R-E-G-E-R are from his descendants. And then Anna married John T. Yoder, who was one of the Yoder Corner Yoders. So we have a lot of Yoders marrying Yoders. Maybe not first cousins, but first and a half to second cousins and so on. Now we come down to the Yoder Corner Yoders, which I did talk about earlier. And the Schrock families, Barbara Yoder married to John Schrock. And this family, David Schrock is the one that came here and left his horse as payment on his farm and went home. John Schrock moved to the Honeyville area. His wife was a Bontrager. And the Honeyville used to have a post office named Schrock, which was named after him, and I also descend from him. Somehow he was known as Rich John, but that's one of the things that kind of soaked away or something, before it came down to me. Here again, Catherine was married to John C. Yoder. Samuel married to Catherine Johns. I have to take a few shortcuts here. I told them I'm not going to be able to use up all my time, but now it looks a little bit different. I'd definitely like to get to the special story about this Samuel Schrock and Catherine Johns. One of the I call it the saddest story of Honeyville, and it's a story that I pieced together. I never saw it printed as a whole, and there was enough evidence around from Rachel Kreider and other older people that knew that something like this happened, and some of them knew something like this happened, didn't have a name for it, and others had a name and didn't know exactly what happened, and so I definitely want to get to that. The Joel Yoder family, Solomon Beam, those were Amish people. Aaron Yoder, there's descendants around here from the Aaron Yoder family, a few. The next family come down to Elizabeth, again married to one of the Yoder Corner brothers. And Samuel Miller, now we have one generation less here, the Peter Baumgartner family. In 1865, the national minister meeting was held at Samuel D. Miller's barn, which is across from the Yoder Corner Cemetery.